My business partner and my wife didn't just steal my company. They took the house, the savings accounts, the trucks, and 32 years of everything I had ever built. My son told me to my face that I was the problem. My daughter didn't even show up to say goodbye. At 63 years old, I was sleeping on a fold-out cot in a storage unit I rented by the month, eating canned soup and wondering how a man goes from running a $40 million construction firm to having nothing left but a box of his dead father's old tools. Then I found the deed. It was folded inside a grease-stained envelope tucked under a rusted pipe wrench at the bottom of my father's toolbox. A piece of land out in West Texas he had paid $2,000 for back in 1971. I figured it was worthless. I figured it was just another scrap of paper from a man who never had much but always believed something better was coming. I was wrong. But before I tell you what that deed changed, I need to tell you what they took, because you have to understand the depth of the hole before you can appreciate the ladder that gets you out. My name is Thomas. Everyone who knows me calls me Tom. I grew up in Amarillo, the son of a man who fixed other people's machines for a living and a mother who made a dollar stretch so far it nearly snapped. We were not poor the way people mean when they say desperate. We were the kind of poor where you are never quite sure, where the heat gets turned down in January because the bill is already late, where you learn early that nothing comes easy and nothing lasts unless you build it to last. My father gave me two things. He gave me a work ethic that bordered on obsession, and he gave me his hands, big, calloused, capable hands that understood angles and load-bearing and the particular satisfaction of something built right. By the time I was 22, I was managing job sites for a mid-size contractor in Dallas. By 28, I had my license and my own small crew. By 40, Hargrove Structural had 30 full-time employees, contracts across 5 states, and a reputation that I was prouder of than anything money could buy. I met my wife at a Chamber of Commerce dinner in 1990. She was sharp, funny, and beautiful in a no-nonsense way that I found more attractive than anything I had encountered before. We married within the year. I thought I had found my equal, someone who would stand beside me in the building of a life the way a good partner stands beside you on a job site. Present, reliable, honest. For the first 15 years, I had no reason to think otherwise. My business partner came into the picture in 1998. He had a background in finance and contracts, everything I lacked on the business side. I was the builder, he was the deal maker. We shook hands on a partnership that split the company 50-50, and for a long time, it worked. We won contracts together that neither of us could have won alone. I trusted him the way you trust someone who has sat across from you at a conference table for 25 years and never once given you a reason to doubt. That was my first mistake. Trust without verification. The signs appeared slowly, the way structural damage always does. Not a sudden collapse, but a slow settling. A hairline crack you keep meaning to look at and never quite do. My business partner started attending meetings with my wife. Meetings she didn't mention until I happened to see his name in her call log. She said it was about refinancing the company real estate. Made sense. He handled the finances. I didn't push. He started appearing at dinner parties she threw, always on the edge of the room, always with a particular look I couldn't name but filed away somewhere in the back of my mind. I was busy. I was always busy. That was its own kind of blindness. The moment I knew for certain came on a Tuesday in March, 3 years ago. I had come home from a site visit early because of a rain delay. The house was supposed to be empty. My wife's car was in the driveway, which surprised me, and when I walked through the back door into the kitchen, I heard her voice in the living room, low and careful, the voice you use when you are not sure who is listening. "He won't fight it," she was saying. "You know how he is. He thinks playing fair means everyone else will too. By the time he figures out what we've done with the operating accounts, it'll be too late to undo it." A pause. "Victor, I'm not nervous. I've been doing this for 2 years. Just make sure Robert has everything filed by Friday." I stood in that kitchen for what felt like 10 minutes. Maybe it was 30 seconds. My coffee thermos was still in my hand, still warm. I set it down on the counter without making a sound, walked back out the door I had come in, got in my truck, and drove. I drove for 3 hours without a destination. The flat Texas landscape scrolled past the window, and I let it. I needed the distance. I needed time between what I had heard and what I was going to do about it. What I did not do was confront them. Not immediately. I had built enough structures to know that when you discover a compromised foundation, you do not start swinging a sledgehammer. You document first. You assess the full extent of the damage. Then you make a plan. I called a forensic accountant I had used years ago on a fraud case involving a subcontractor. I told him what I had heard. I told him to go back 5 years in the company books and tell me everything he found. Then I hired a private investigator, a woman I found through a lawyer friend in Houston, who told me she was the best he had ever worked with. What they uncovered over the next 8 weeks destroyed whatever remained of my belief that I had known either of them. My business partner had been systematically rerouting company revenue into accounts that existed only on paper. He had created 3 shell entities using my signature, forged on documents I had never seen. He had restructured my ownership stake in a way that, on paper, made me look like a silent investor rather than a co-founder. The work was meticulous. The kind of thing that takes years of planning and someone who knows exactly how company dissolution proceedings work. My wife had provided him access to the home office where I kept physical records, access to the company seal, access to personal financial information that no outside party should have had. The investigator found hotel records, messages, a level of coordination that told me this had not started 2 years ago. It had started closer to 5. She had been building the exit for years while I built the company. I brought everything to a lawyer, an older man with an impressive track record who told me what I wanted to hear, that the evidence was strong, that no court would ignore this level of documented fraud, that we would win. He was wrong, or more accurately, he was outmatched. My business partner had not used just any attorneys. He had retained a firm with deep connections to the commercial court system in our county, people who knew procedures and scheduling and which judges had which blind spots. Before my lawyer could file the first motion, my business partner's team had already filed preemptive claims asserting that I had abandoned my operational role in the company, that my erratic behavior had damaged the business, and that the forensic discrepancies in the accounts were the result of my own mismanagement. They produced documents, signed documents, bearing what looked exactly like my signature, authorizing every transaction my business partner had made. The forgeries were so clean that even the forensic accountant hesitated when he reviewed them. My wife filed for divorce the same week. Her attorneys, who turned out to be affiliated with the same firm representing my business partner, filed for an emergency asset freeze, claiming that I was attempting to move marital property ahead of proceedings. The asset freeze locked every account I had access to. My personal savings, my salary draw from the company, everything. Overnight, I went from being the owner of a $40 million business to a man who could not access the $1,200 sitting in his checking account. I had one resource they had not found. 3 years earlier, after a conversation with my father about never being entirely without options, I had started keeping a small emergency fund in cash, inside a fireproof lockbox in the bed of my work truck. $4,000, accumulated slowly, never mentioned to anyone. It was enough to rent the storage unit and survive while I tried to understand what was happening to me. The divorce proceedings became a masterclass in how a corrupt system can be manipulated by people who know its mechanisms. My wife's legal team portrayed me as a domineering and financially controlling husband who had isolated her from her own assets throughout our marriage. They brought in a financial expert who described patterns of economic abuse. They produced a friend of my wife's who testified that she had confided fears about my behavior for years. I sat in that courtroom and watched 32 years of my life get rewritten by strangers. My son testified. He sat in the witness chair and told the judge that I had been an absent father, consumed by the business, emotionally unavailable, and dismissive of his mother's needs. My daughter did not testify, but she submitted a written statement that her attorney read aloud, describing our home as a place of tension and control. When my son walked past me after his testimony, he did not look at me. I wanted to grab his arm, I wanted to say that everything he had just repeated were his mother's words and not his memories. But I also understood that he had lived with her while I lived at work, and that the version of me she had been building in his mind for years had more square footage than the version of me that actually came home. The judge ruled on a Thursday afternoon. The company was to be transferred entirely to my business partner's control, pending the resolution of the commercial dispute, on the basis that I had been functionally inactive in operations for the preceding 18 months. The marital home, the lake house, the vehicles, and all liquid assets in joint accounts went to my wife as primary settlement. I was awarded a nominal future claim contingent on the outcome of the commercial litigation, which my wife's attorneys assured the court could take years to resolve. I walked out of that courthouse in November with the clothes I was wearing, my work truck, and $4,000 minus what I had already spent. My lawyer called it a temporary setback. I fired him the following morning. The storage unit was 10 by 12 feet, climate controlled, and cost $87 a month. I kept my cot on one side and my father's toolbox on the other. Everything else I owned fit in between. I took work where I could find it, day labor mostly, the kind of jobs where nobody asks for paperwork and nobody remembers your name. I repaired a fence for a rancher outside of town. I helped a family move a manufactured home. I spent 4 days in the February cold digging post holes for a man who paid me in cash and a hot meal. I was 63 years old. My back remembered every year. The nights were the worst part, not because of the physical discomfort, though the cot was unforgiving on old joints. The nights were worst because the mind has nothing to do in the dark except review its inventory of failures. I lay there and ran through every decision I had made, every warning I had ignored. Every evening I had come home too tired to notice that the distance between my wife and me had grown into something uncrossable. I thought about my son's face when he walked past me in that courtroom. I thought about my daughter's written statement and wondered how many of those words she had believed when she wrote them and how many she had simply been handed. There were nights when I sat on the edge of that cot and genuinely could not see a path forward. Not in a dramatic way, just in the quiet way that a man looks at the road ahead and cannot find the light. One of those nights, I pulled my father's toolbox out from the corner and opened it. I don't know why. Grief, maybe. Or just the need to hold something that had belonged to someone who loved me without conditions. My father died 6 years before all of this. He had been a simple man. He fixed industrial equipment for a manufacturing plant in Amarillo for 30 years, put 2 kids through school, paid off a small house, and never once complained about any of it. The only extravagance I ever knew him to have was a belief, quiet and unshakable, that land was the one thing that never truly went away. He said it the way some men say grace, like it was a principle as reliable as gravity. I went through the toolbox slowly. A socket wrench set he had used for 30 years, a pipe cutter with a cracked handle he had wrapped in electrical tape and kept using anyway, a box of drill bits organized by size in a coffee tin. At the bottom, under a folded shop rag that had hardened with age, there was a document envelope, thick manila, edges darkened from years in the box, sealed with a strip of tape that had long since lost its adhesion. I opened it and found 3 items. A handwritten letter, a surveyor's map of a property in Reeves County, Texas, and a deed, recorded with the Reeves County Clerk's Office on September 14th, 1971, showing that my father had purchased 12 acres of raw land for $2,000. I read the letter first. Tom, he had written, and the handwriting was my father's, unhurried and certain, the way he approached everything. If you're reading this, it's because I finally remembered to tell you about this and then ran out of time to do it face to face, which would be the most like me. I bought this piece of land back when you were a little boy because a man at the plant told me it might be worth something someday. I never had it in me to sell it because selling a piece of ground feels like admitting you've stopped believing in the future. I'm leaving it to you because you're the one who builds things. And I think you understand that some things take a long time to become what they're supposed to be. There's a mineral rights lease on the file with the county. A company called Permian Basin Gas Partners signed it in 1994. I never told your mother because she would have wanted to spend it, and I always thought it should wait. Whatever is in that account is yours. Use it for something worth using it for. I love you, son. I sat with that letter for a long time. Then I refolded it and put it back in the envelope and sat in the storage unit, listening to the sound of traffic on the highway 2 blocks away. The next morning I drove to Reeves County. It took most of a day. I arrived at the county clerk's office 40 minutes before it closed and asked a clerk to pull the records on the parcel. She was a younger woman with reading glasses pushed up on her head, and she found the file in about 10 minutes. The mineral rights lease was there, executed in 1994 between my father and Permian Basin Gas Partners, a division of what had since become a much larger energy company. The lease had been renewed twice, and there was an attached notation indicating that royalty payments had been deposited into a trust account at a bank in Midland pending verification of the current heir. She looked at me over her glasses. You the son? I am. They've been waiting on someone to come claim this for going on 6 years now, she said. Your father died without settling it, and nobody knew to contact. I drove to Midland the same evening. I found a motel for $40 a night and sat on the edge of the bed and stared at the wall until it was time to sleep. The bank opened at 9. I was in the parking lot at 8:30 in the same wrinkled sport coat I had worn to the divorce hearing. The trust officer was a methodical man in his mid-50s who asked me for 3 forms of identification, a copy of my father's death certificate, and the original deed. I had all of it. I had put the documents in a manila folder on the passenger seat of my truck and driven carefully the whole way. The way you drive when you are carrying something that cannot be replaced. He took everything to a back office. I sat in a chair in the lobby and watched a mounted television in the corner showing a morning news program with the sound turned off. I looked at the captions without reading them. A woman came by and offered me coffee. I took it and did not drink it. The trust officer came back 32 minutes later. He sat down across from me and placed a folder on the table between us and folded his hands on top of it. Mr. Hargrove, he said, the account has been active since the first lease payment in 1995. Royalty deposits continued on a quarterly basis through the lease renewals. The current balance, including accrued interest on the trust account, is $4,312,000. The room stayed still. The television continued to show silent news. There's something else, he said. He opened the folder. The energy company exercised a buyout option on the mineral rights in 2021. The buyout payment was deposited into the trust at that time. That amount alone was $3,400,000. The total figure I gave you includes that payment plus the accumulated royalties and interest since 1995. I looked at the number on the paper he turned toward me. I read it twice. This is real, I said. It was not quite a question. I verified it myself this morning, he said. This is real. I drove back to Amarillo that night. I did not drive fast. The highway was dark and the stars were out over the flat land, and I thought about my father, who had believed in a $2,000 piece of ground for 50 years and never told a soul because he thought it should wait, who had fixed industrial equipment for 30 years and worn out his hands and raised 2 children and paid off his house, and left behind a toolbox and a letter and a deed that nobody knew to look for. I thought about what he had written. Use it for something worth using it for. I did not feel euphoria. I felt something more complicated. Gratitude with grief inside it. Clarity with grief inside that too. The first thing I did was move into a short-term rental apartment. Nothing extravagant. 2 bedrooms, clean, with a proper kitchen and a door that locked. I bought a decent suit. I needed to look like a man who had resources, because what I was about to do required credibility. Then I found a lawyer. Not the kind who pats your shoulder and tells you the truth always comes out. I needed the kind who had spent a career understanding exactly how the truth gets buried and how to dig it back up. Her name was Margaret Chen. She was 51 years old, had a law degree from UT Austin and a secondary credential in forensic accounting, and had spent the first decade of her career at the SEC before going into private practice. Her office walls were covered in cases she had won against people who thought the rules did not apply to them. When I sat down across from her and laid out the full story, she listened for an hour without interrupting. Then she asked 8 questions, each one more precise than the last. When I finished answering, she leaned back. "The document forgery is your strongest angle," she said. "Forging ownership transfer documents is a federal crime if those documents were used in interstate commerce, which yours were. We can refer that to the FBI while simultaneously pursuing the civil case. How long? If we're methodical, 6 to 8 months before we're ready to move. You cannot rush this. Every piece of evidence has to be bulletproof because the other side will spend a great deal of money trying to poke holes in it." "I have time," I said. She looked at me for a moment. "You have resources now?" "I do." "Then we have everything we need." I did not tell her about the full amount. Banking privacy was my first line of protection, and I had learned from what happened with my company that visible wealth makes you a target. I funded the legal work through a separate account in the trust and told no one else. Not my son, not my daughter, not anyone. Margaret worked quietly and thoroughly. She hired a digital forensics team that spent 2 months reconstructing the electronic trail of the document forgeries. They found something the original forensic accountant had not found because he had not known to look: a series of metadata traces on the forged files that tied the documents to a computer registered to a legal assistant at my business partner's attorney's firm. The forgeries had not been done by my business partner directly. They had been prepared professionally. That meant conspiracy. That meant the attorneys themselves were implicated. Margaret brought in a former federal prosecutor who agreed that the case warranted referral to the U.S. Attorney's Office. While that process was developing, she filed the civil suit to recover the company and all diverted assets. I spent those months living quietly. I took on some consulting work through a former colleague, reviewing structural plans for a firm that did not know my history. The work was satisfying in a way that running my own company had never quite been because there was no politics in it, just the problem and the solution. I kept my profile low. I drove the same truck. I ate at diners and cooked at home and did not post anything on social media because I still did not want my business partner or my former wife to know that my circumstances had changed. I also did something else during those months. I started quietly watching my children. Margaret had suggested it after I mentioned that my son had testified against me. She said that in her experience, adult children who are used as leverage in a fraudulent divorce almost always harbor doubt. They know the story they were told has edges that don't line up. They simply don't have a way to surface that doubt without collapsing the narrative they've been living inside. I did not approach them. I found out through the kind of public records that are available to anyone with the patience to look that my son was struggling with a small business he had started during the divorce period, a landscaping operation that had taken on too much overhead and was 30 days from defaulting on an equipment loan. My former wife, who now had access to all of the marital assets, had declined to help him. I created a business line of credit through one of the trust entities, anonymous. The terms were better than anything a bank would offer, and the paperwork was handled through a law firm in a different city. My son accepted it. He never knew. My daughter, I learned, had been quietly estranged from her mother for nearly a year, the result of a disagreement over money that I could only partially piece together. She was living in Denver, working as a physical therapist, and had made no public comment about any of the proceedings. I did not know what she believed about me. I did not know if she had believed it from the start or had slowly stopped believing it. I only knew she was out there, and that I still loved her the way you love someone who has caused you real pain, completely and without condition. The federal investigation moved faster than any of us expected. The connection between the forged documents and the law firm created what the prosecutor later described as a significant evidentiary windfall. It turned out that my business partner's attorneys had used similar tactics in at least 3 previous commercial cases, manufacturing documentation to force settlement outcomes that their clients wanted. 2 of those previous victims were still reachable. Both agreed to cooperate. Margaret called me on a Monday morning in October. "We're ready," she said. "The U.S. attorney is filing charges this week. Simultaneously, I'm filing the emergency motion to restore your company ownership and freeze the fraudulently transferred assets. I asked the question I had been holding for 8 months. My business partner and my former wife. Will they know it's coming? They will not know, she said, until it arrives. He was at an industry conference. My former wife was at a charity gala she had organized in my old house, an event she had apparently been planning for months. A fundraiser for a cause I had once donated to generously, held in the rooms where I had lived for 21 years. The arrest warrants were executed simultaneously. Federal agents found my business partner in the conference hotel lobby, surrounded by people who had respected him for years. My former wife's gala was interrupted when officers arrived at the front door with paperwork. Her guests stood in the living room of my house, holding their drinks while she was escorted outside. I was not there. I did not need to be. I sat in my apartment and received updates by text from the investigator. Margaret had kept on retainer for operational matters. He sent me 3 words when it was done. It's over. Confirmed. I put the phone down and sat quietly for a while. No celebration. No raised fist. Just a long, slow exhale, and the sound of the evening news I had forgotten was on. The civil hearing to restore my company ownership came 6 weeks later, before a federal judge who had reviewed the complete forensic case. Margaret presented 4 hours of evidence. The opposing counsel, now operating with 2 of their senior partners under indictment, mounted a defense that the judge described in her written opinion as wholly insufficient given the weight of documented fraud presented. She restored my ownership stake in full. She ordered the recovery of all diverted assets and imposed sanctions on the legal entities that had participated in the scheme. When Margaret called to read me the ruling, I was quiet for a moment, and then I said, "What do we do next?" She laughed. It was the first time I had heard her laugh. We let the criminal case proceed. We complete the asset recovery. And then, Mr. Hargrove, you decide what you want to do with the rest of your life. My son called me 2 days after the news broke. The criminal charges had been covered in the business press, and the story of the forged documents and the colluding law firm had gotten enough traction that it was hard to avoid if you knew the names involved. He sounded different from the man who had walked past me in the courtroom. He sounded like my son, the one I remembered before any of this, the one who used to call me from job sites when he was learning the business and ask me questions he already knew the answer to just because he liked talking through problems together. "Dad," he said, and then he was quiet for a long moment. I let the silence sit. I did not fill it for him. "I need you to know that I knew," he said, finally. "Not the forgeries and not the legal stuff. But I knew something wasn't right with what she was telling me about you. I knew some of it didn't match what I actually remembered. And I testified anyway." "Why?" Another long pause. "Because I was afraid that if I didn't believe her, it meant she had been lying to me about things my whole life. And I didn't know how to live with that." "Can you live with it now?" "I'm trying to," he said. "I'm really trying to." I told him that I appreciated him calling. I told him that what he did hurt me in a way I would not pretend otherwise. And I told him that hurt does not cancel love, not in my understanding of the word, and that if he was willing to do the work of rebuilding something real between us, I was willing to start. He said yes. He said it immediately, without hesitation, the way you say yes when you have been waiting to say it for a long time. My daughter called a week later from Denver. Her voice was cautious the way a voice is when it is carrying a lot of weight and trying not to let any of it show. She told me she had written that statement under pressure, that she had not believed most of what she wrote but had written it because her mother told her the only way to protect herself financially after the divorce was to be on the right side of the outcome. "There is no right side," I told her. "There's just what you do and what you live with afterward." She cried. I did not try to stop her. I let her cry the way I had needed to let my son be quiet, because some things have to move through a person at their own pace. When she was calmer, I told her I forgave her, not because what she did hadn't mattered, but because forgiveness, in my experience, is not a favor you do for the person who wronged you. It is the thing you do for yourself, so you can stop carrying the weight of their mistake on top of your own. The criminal trial took place the following spring. My former wife pled guilty to conspiracy charges in exchange for a reduced sentence. My business partner went to trial. His attorneys managed one delay after another, But eventually the forensic evidence was simply too complete. The jury deliberated for less than a day, guilty on all counts. The judge sentenced him to 11 years. When they led him out of the courtroom, he looked at me once. I do not know what he expected to see. Whatever he was looking for, I don't think he found it. I walked out of the courthouse into a bright April morning and stood on the steps for a moment. Margaret came to stand beside me. "How does it feel?" she asked. "Like a building that's finally been level set," I said. She nodded. It was the right kind of answer. I sold a controlling interest in the company to the management team that had kept it running during the dispute. They deserved it, and I no longer needed to be the one running it. I kept a minority stake for the income, and because my name was on the door, and my father's values were in the foundation of every structure that company had ever built, and I was not ready to let that go entirely. I kept the cash from the trust. $4 million. I sat with that number for a long time before deciding what to do with it. The way you sit with a material you're not sure how to use before you figure out the right application. My father had said to use it for something worth using it for. I created a fund. I named it the Raymond Hargrove Trust, after the man who had fixed machines for 30 years and believed in a piece of ground nobody else wanted because he thought some things just need time. The purpose of the fund was specific: to provide legal resources to working-class business owners who had been the targets of ownership fraud and document forgery. People who had built things with their hands and their time and been stripped of them through the manipulation of systems they had trusted. People who could not afford the kind of legal firepower that I had been fortunate enough to find. In the first year, the fund handled 9 cases. We won 7 of them. The other 2 are still in progress. I hired Margaret as the fund's lead legal advisor. She took a reduced rate and said the work was the most useful thing she had done in her career. I moved into a house I bought in the neighborhood where I grew up. Not a large house, 3 bedrooms, a yard that needed attention, a garage where I set up a proper workshop. I spent weekends out there the way my father had spent weekends in his garage, with the radio on and the satisfaction of making something with my hands. My son started coming by on Sundays. We had coffee and talked about the business, about his landscaping operation that had stabilized and was starting to grow. He never directly asked me about the business line of credit that had saved it. I never confirmed it. At a certain point, I think we both understood that some gifts are better left unnamed. My daughter flew in from Denver for Thanksgiving. The 3 of us sat around a table I had built myself from reclaimed lumber and ate a meal she and my son had largely prepared, and the awkwardness of the first hour gave way to something that felt like the beginning of a thing, not fully formed yet, still a little fragile, but genuine. After dinner, she asked me the question my son had been too careful to ask. "Dad, did you know it was going to work out? When you were in that storage unit, did you believe it?" I thought about that honestly before I answered. "No," I said. There were nights when I did not believe anything, when the only reason I did not give up was that giving up requires a decision, and I was too tired to make decisions. But you kept going. I kept going because my father's toolbox was sitting in the corner, and every time I looked at it, I thought about a man who bought $2,000 worth of ground in the middle of nowhere and never told anyone about it because he believed something was coming. He didn't know what. He didn't know when. He just believed it, and he waited. She was quiet for a moment. "Do you miss him?" "Every day," I said. "More now than before, because now I understand what he was trying to teach me, and I never got to tell him that I finally understood." She reached across the table and put her hand on mine, and we sat like that for a while, with the dinner dishes still in front of us, and the sound of my son washing pans in the kitchen. And I thought about how strange it is that the worst thing that happens to you can be the thing that clarifies everything else, that strips away what you only thought you needed, and leaves you standing with what you actually have. I had a company on paper for 25 years. I had what I thought was a marriage, and what I thought were friendships, and what I thought was a life that added up to something. And then it was taken, and I found out what was actually left underneath all of it. And what was left was this: my children, imperfect and real, willing to do the hard work of being honest. My own hands, still capable, a name worth keeping, and a piece of land my father bought for $2,000 in 1971 because he believed the future was worth preparing for. The day after Thanksgiving, I drove out to Reeves County. I had never actually seen the land, just the deed and the surveyor's map. I found the parcel off a county road outside of Pecos. 12 acres of flat West Texas earth with some scrub and scattered rock and a sky that went on in every direction without interruption. I stood there for a while with the wind moving across the ground the way it always moves in that part of Texas. Steady and indifferent and old. My father had stood here too, 50 years ago. Paid $2,000 for 12 acres that nobody else thought was worth holding, believed something was coming. Never said a word. I thought about what he had written at the end of his letter. Use it for something worth using it for. I looked at the ground and the sky and the long, flat distance, and I thought that I had. I thought that I was trying to, and that trying was what he meant. I got back in my truck and drove home. Have you ever lost everything and found something better on the other side? Tell me in the comments, and tell me where you're listening from. If this story meant something to you, I'd be grateful for a like or a subscription. There's more coming. See you in the next one.